Okay, think about the last time you bought a cup of coffee. You probably handed over a dollar bill, or maybe tapped your card, and honestly didn't give it a second thought. But try paying for that exact same coffee if paper money simply didn't exist. Well, welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack America's incredibly bizarre history before standard paper currency. We're looking at exactly how an entire civilization managed to function without the most basic tool of modern commerce, and in the process completely redefined what money actually is.
86. That is the number of years that the United States operated as an independent nation with exactly 0 federally issued paper dollars circulating through the economy. None. And, in the century and a half before independence, back when they were British colonies, the situation was somehow even stranger. You see, the British Crown actively and deliberately prohibited the colonies from minting their own coins. The right to issue currency was strictly tied to sovereignty, and England definitely wasn't about to give the colonies even a hint of independence. Plus, whatever precious metal coins the colonists actually did manage to bring over were pretty quickly drained right back to Britain to pay for imported goods. So they were completely stranded, forced to figure out how to function without currency.
Okay, let's dive into this and see how they improvised. Their very first solution was literally the oldest economic system in human history, barter. But, as you can guess, it was maddeningly slow. Imagine you're a blacksmith in 1640s Massachusetts. Step 1, you need flour and you have horseshoes to trade. Step 2, you head to the miller, but the miller doesn't need horseshoes right now. So step 3, you have to scramble to find a third person who needs your horseshoes and just happens to have something the miller actually wants, all just to arrange a complex three-way trade. It was an absolute drag on economic growth.
So the colonists realized pretty quickly they needed a better medium of exchange, which led directly to commodity money. In 1619, Virginia officially made tobacco legal tender. Now, it seemed brilliant at first. It was highly divisible, you could easily adjust the weight for large or small purchases, and practically everyone wanted it. But the downsides? They were severe. Tobacco spoiled easily. It was incredibly bulky to haul around for large purchases, and worst of all, its value fluctuated wildly. A bumper crop could cause devastating inflation literally overnight, having your life savings just because there happened to be a really great harvest.
To really grasp the absurdity of this commodity economy, consider the number 120. When the Virginia companies shipped young women over to the colony to serve as brides for the settlers, the going rate to literally buy a wife was 120 pounds of tobacco. You could pay your taxes, you could settle your debts, and you could even acquire a spouse, all using dried leaves.
Now, further north, another form of commodity money took hold, wampum. These were very carefully crafted beads made from whelk and quahog shells. Now, it is absolutely crucial to note that for the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands, wampum was not money at all. It held deep diplomatic and spiritual significance. However, Dutch and English colonists recognized just how essential it was to indigenous life, co-opted it, and started mass-producing it using European tools. From 1643 to 1660, Massachusetts actually declared these shell beads official legal tender.
Because England still wasn't sending over any coins, the colonies relied really heavily on foreign silver, specifically the Spanish milled dollar, or what they called pieces of 8. This was a highly trusted global silver coin from the Spanish Empire, and it essentially became the standard. And here is a fascinating detail. When colonists needed to make change, they would literally take a knife or chisel and cut the physical coin into 8 pieces, or bits. So if you had a quarter of a dollar, you literally had 2 bits. That is exactly where we get the classic phrase, 2 bits for a quarter today.
But this constant improvising finally hit a breaking point in 1690. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had just launched this disastrous military expedition against the French in Canada during King William's War. The soldiers returned, understandably expecting to be paid, but the treasury was completely empty. There was no gold, there was no silver. So out of sheer desperation, Massachusetts did something absolutely unprecedented in the Western world. They invented paper bills of credit, basically government IOUs, just to pay off their armed and very angry soldiers. And surprisingly, it actually worked initially. Pretty soon, nearly every other colony wanted in on the action, but it created an absolute cross-border nightmare. Eventually, you had 14 different colonies printing their own wildly fluctuating notes. You had the Massachusetts pound, which was trusted locally. You had the Pennsylvania pound, which varied in trust entirely depending on how close you were to the border. And a Virginia pound, well, that might be steeply discounted or just outright refused by a merchant in another colony. This monetary chaos totally infuriated the British government, leading them to pass the Currency Acts to shut it down. And that was a major grievance that helped push America straight toward revolution.
So fast forward to when the Revolutionary War breaks out in 1775. The Continental Congress faced a massive problem. Wars are extraordinarily expensive, and they had absolutely no power to levy taxes to pay for it. With gold scarce, they turned back to the printing press, creating a new paper currency called the Continental dollar. The execution was so catastrophic that it actually gave birth to a legendary insult: not worth a continental.
By 1779, Congress and the individual states had pumped roughly $241 million of unbacked paper currency into the economy. To put that into perspective, the entire pre-war colonial economy generated only a fraction of that amount. Inflation skyrocketed so severely that a wagon load of Continentals could barely buy a wagon load of actual supplies for Washington's army. One barber in Philadelphia reportedly used the worthless bills to wallpaper his shop. In another city, a dog was actually tarred, feathered in Continental notes and paraded through the streets as a joke.
So the really crucial point here is how this whole disaster fundamentally shaped the nation's founding. The delegates of the 1787 Constitutional Convention had the scars of that hyperinflation fresh in their minds. So they attempted a constitutional fix based entirely on hard money, meaning gold and silver with intrinsic value. They explicitly forbade states from printing paper money and deliberately omitted the federal government's ability to do so as well. In 1792, they passed the Coinage Act, aiming to build an economy completely on the undeniable value of precious metals.
But, as you might guess, there was a massive practical flaw to this rigid system. The United States was a rapidly expanding nation. Farmers desperately needed credit just to buy seed, and merchants needed capital for trade, but the newly established mint simply couldn't produce enough coins to keep up. To make matters worse, whatever gold and silver was actually minted was often hoarded or exported overseas where the raw metal was simply worth more. This strict hard money system was literally starving a growing economy of the credit and circulating currency it desperately needed to function. They were, once again, trying to figure out how to function without currency.
Because the economy was essentially suffocating, private banks rushed in to fill the void, kicking off what's known as the wildcat banking era from roughly 1837 to 1863. This really went into high gear after President Andrew Jackson, a man who deeply distrusted paper money, dismantled the second bank of the United States. With no central bank to regulate the money supply, state-chartered private banks exploded onto the scene. They were printing their own private paper banknotes, which were essentially just IOUs from individual banks.
The sheer scale of this is honestly hard to even wrap your head around. At one point, there were over 8,000 different varieties of private banknotes circulating at once in the United States. That is more distinct types of paper currency than there are in the entire world today. Every single bank printed notes that looked completely different at different denominations, and they traded at totally different values depending on the specific bank's reputation. American finance had quite literally turned into the Wild West.
And it gets even more chaotic. Because there was absolutely no uniformity and oversight was terrible, counterfeiting became a massive industry. It was estimated that a staggering 1 out of every 3 bills in circulation was completely fake. Merchants couldn't just accept a bill. They had to constantly consult these pocket-sized directories called banknote reporters just to verify if the note was from a real bank, if it was a known counterfeit, and exactly how much it was actually worth on that specific day. This wildly dysfunctional system of scattered private banknotes and scarce gold coins just sort of limped along until a massive shock to the system, the 1861 Civil War fiscal earthquake. The federal government suddenly needed to finance massive armies, purchase actual mountains of weaponry, and sustain a huge war effort. The old, fractured monetary system was completely incapable of handling this. By late 1861, the government's gold reserves were running dangerously low, and they realized they could no longer redeem their own notes.
Facing the literal collapse of the nation, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act in 1862, establishing a rule that changed everything. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. For the very first time, the U.S. government issued paper money, nicknamed greenbacks, that were not backed by gold or silver. They were backed by absolutely nothing but the full faith and credit of the government. By law, if someone offered to pay a debt with these pieces of green paper, you were legally obligated to accept them.
And this brilliantly illustrates the bigger picture. When you look back at this whole journey from improvising with wampum and tobacco to the disastrous Continental dollar, through the absolute chaos of wildcat notes, all the way to the greenback, you realize its entire history is really just a centuries-long experiment in institutional trust. Money isn't just a physical object, right? It's a symbol backed by authority.
The greenback survived where the Continental dollar completely failed because, by 1862, the United States had finally built institutions and tax revenues strong enough to actually make its promises credible. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. Your modern dollar is a direct descendant of those wartime greenbacks, an unbacked piece of paper, or nowadays just a digital number on a screen, relying entirely on invisible trust. So, is the promise backing your digital dollar stronger or weaker today than it was in 1862? Take a look in your wallet and think about the centuries of struggle, failure, and sheer trust that make that crumpled bill worth anything at all. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. We'll see you next time.